Saturday night, during a December broadcast, a holiday sketch aired on Saturday Night Live in the form of a mock Christmas address staged to resemble the White House, explicitly targeting former President Donald Trump. And that is the event. It matters now because satire does not appear in a vacuum. It reflects what has already entered the public record and signals what remains unresolved. Beginning with jokes about Christmas decorations associated with Melania Trump that were not invented for the sketch, but drawn from widely documented public reaction during Trump's presidency, including criticism and sustained media attention, before moving rapidly through immigration, speech patterns, foreign policy, personal fixation, and media spectacle, each exaggerated but none random, starting with immigration, where Arctic immigrants entering through chimneys was parody anchored to a factual record in which Trump repeatedly framed immigration as an invasion using language of threat and siege that is documented on the record, followed by a caricature of speech style built from repetition, interruptions, self-praise, and sudden pivots that mirror hours of recorded speeches and rallies, then a visual gag involving embracing a Christmas tree that reframed public moments of physical interaction with national symbols, leading into a fictional claim of a solo military invasion of Venezuela that was clearly absurd, yet rested on a documented history of erratic foreign policy statements, threats made and reversed, and contradictions delivered within the same news cycle, followed by renaming jokes involving the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial that parodied but accurately reflected a pattern of personal branding while in office, from hotels and properties to merchandise and identity, before the tone shifted to Jeffrey Epstein, where claims of transparency were paired with jokes about redactions and missing files, not to introduce new facts, but to reference unresolved issues involving delays, partial releases, and conflicting statements that remain part of the public record, culminating in a fictional Patriot Games spectacle staged at the White House that exaggerated but drew from a documented reliance on ratings, crowd size, and television framing, openly stated by Trump himself. The episode ended with a holiday greeting and standard sign-off, clearly labeled as comedy with no statements presented as factual reporting, which is correct, but satire does not absolve the record it draws from. It depends on it. And the question is not whether the sketch was fair, because comedy is not evidence, but why so much material remains available to satirize, a question that requires returning to the record itself, what was said, what was done, and what remains unresolved, because the record does not stop there. Strip away the jokes and the record underneath is straightforward, because every exaggerated claim in that sketch corresponds to something verifiable, something previously said or done, and something that still carries consequences. Take immigration first, where the parody leaned on invasion imagery because Donald Trump repeatedly described immigration in those terms, not once but over years, calling it an invasion, warning of criminals and disease, and framing it as an existential threat, language that is preserved on video, in transcripts, and in official statements. And while no one claims Arctic immigrants exist, the underlying framing is real and documented, which is why the exaggeration lands move next to the caricature of speech itself, the repetition, the digressions, the self-referential praise, because that pattern is measurable, observable, and repeatedly noted by nonpartisan media monitors who tracked rally speeches that looped, contradicted earlier remarks, or abandoned prepared text. And the sketch does not invent that rhythm, it amplifies it. The foreign policy joke follows the same structure. A fictional solo invasion of Venezuela, absurd on its face, yet grounded in a record of public threats, abrupt reversals, and policy announcements made on social media before agencies or allies were briefed, a pattern confirmed by former officials who described learning of positions after they were announced, not before. Then there is the branding humor, renaming monuments, which works only because Trump openly merged office and personal brand, refusing full divestment, promoting properties, and placing his name at the center of political identity, a fact acknowledged in ethics filings, court records, and contemporaneous reporting. The Epstein reference is more precise because it points to a factual gap rather than a joke. The repeated promises of transparency around files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, followed by partial releases, redactions, and jurisdictional disputes, none of which are fictional, all of which are documented, and while the sketch made no accusation, it highlighted the absence of clarity, which remains unresolved. Crucially, none of these moments required new claims, because the existing record was sufficient. And that is where responsibility widens from the individual to the system that allowed contradictions to pass without sustained consequence, from media cycles that moved on, to institutions that issued statements without enforcement, to political allies who normalized behavior by repetition rather than rebuttal. The concrete consequence is not the sketch itself, but the durability of the material it draws from. A presidency so densely documented, with contradictions, reversals, and spectacle, that a single monologue can reference immigration, foreign policy, personal branding, and unresolved investigations without explanation and still be understood, which tells you the baseline is already established. Satire did not create that baseline, it inherited it. And the responsibility for that inheritance lies with the actor who produced the record and with those who enabled it by minimizing, deflecting, or refusing to confront it when it occurred. That is not a moral conclusion. It is a factual sequence, action, documentation, normalization, consequence. The pattern becomes clearer from here. What matters next is repetition, because none of this is isolated. And the sketch works precisely because it compresses years of conduct into minutes without losing clarity. The immigration framing did not begin or end with one speech. It was repeated across campaigns, executive actions, and court filings, with language escalating rather than narrowing, producing measurable effects, including family separation policies, emergency declarations, and prolonged litigation, all documented in official records. The speech patterns mocked in the monologue did not fade with office. They persisted into post-presidency rallies and interviews where claims were repeated even after being corrected and where volume replaced verification, a pattern that matters because repetition itself became a political tool. Foreign policy volatility followed the same arc with public statements that moved markets, unsettled allies, or contradicted briefings, then were walked back or reframed, leaving institutions to absorb the instability, a fact acknowledged by former diplomats and defense officials on the record. The branding impulse, likewise, did not recede, as campaign messaging, fundraising, and legal defenses continued to center the individual rather than the office, blurring lines that ethics frameworks are designed to keep clear. The Epstein reference fits this pattern of repetition through omission because promises of disclosure were made, delayed, partially fulfilled, then rhetorically closed without resolution, leaving unanswered questions that persist precisely because no final accounting was delivered. Beneficiaries of this pattern are identifiable: media ecosystems that profit from spectacle, political allies who avoid accountability by reframing controversy as persecution, and fundraising operations that convert outrage into revenue, all verifiable through filings, coverage analysis, and public statements. Victims are also identifiable, institutions whose credibility erodes when norms are bent repeatedly. Voters left navigating contradiction rather than clarity, and policy processes weakened by personalization and improvisation. This is not abstract harm. It appears in court backlogs, agency turnover, and diplomatic repair work undertaken after statements were made without coordination. The institutional implication is straightforward. When repetition normalizes contradiction, correction loses force, and satire becomes a shorthand for unresolved accountability rather than a release valve, which is why a comedy sketch can function as a summary rather than a critique. The escalation is not in the joke. It is in the accumulation of record that makes explanation unnecessary. By this stage, recognition replaces surprise, and familiarity replaces scrutiny, which is itself a consequence worth naming, because it signals a shift from evaluating claims to enduring them. That shift does not happen accidentally. It results from sustained behavior, met with insufficient correction over time. There is one final element that has to be addressed. The strongest defense offered in response to all of this is familiar and simple. It was just comedy. It was exaggeration. It should not be treated as evidence of anything. And that defense deserves to be addressed directly, because it is correct only up to a point and then it fails. Satire is not proof, and no sketch can establish facts on its own. But satire also does not generate material ex nihilo. It relies on a pre-existing record that audiences already recognize, and in this case that record belongs to Donald Trump, preserved in speeches, interviews, executive actions, court filings, and public statements that are independently verifiable. The defense collapses when it suggests that exaggeration excuses the underlying conduct, because exaggeration works by stretching something that already exists, not by inventing it, and each stretched element in that monologue corresponds to something documented, from immigration rhetoric framed as invasion, to governance conducted through spectacle, to branding that blurred public office with personal identity, to unresolved promises of transparency that were never fully honored. Another version of the defense argues that criticism itself proves unfair treatment, that mockery reflects media bias rather than conduct. But that argument requires ignoring the timeline, because the behavior came first and the response followed, not the other way around. And the record shows that many of the claims referenced were controversial at the moment they were made, not retroactively reframed. Responsibility, therefore, cannot be assigned to comedians or to audiences or to abstract media culture. It rests with the actor who produced the material and with the institutions and allies who declined to impose consistent consequences when norms were violated, statements contradicted reality, or obligations went unmet. This is where a judgment becomes unavoidable, not because satire demands it, but because the record does. A record in which escalation was met with normalization, repetition was met with fatigue, and unresolved questions were allowed to linger without final accounting. The harm is not that a sketch aired. The harm is that it required no explanation, that viewers could follow references to immigration, foreign policy, branding, and Epstein-related secrecy without context, because the context had already been supplied over years. Assigning responsibility here means stating plainly that a public figure who repeatedly centered governance on spectacle, contradiction, and personal grievance created an environment where parody functions as summary, and that those who enabled, excused, or minimized that behavior share responsibility for its durability. This is not a moral flourish. It is the end of the evidentiary chain, action, documentation, repetition, normalization, consequence, and when that chain is intact, judgment is not optional, it is the final step. There is no redemptive turn here, no lesson learned, no closure offered, only a record that remains open because accountability was deferred when it mattered most, and because deferral, repeated often enough, becomes its own form of decision.